Are we set?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to start with parasitology. I have the sheets there. I put the spelling of the 4 main classifications because I knew somebody was going to say, how do we spell this? So classifications, don't forget your papers when you walk in if you want to follow with the papers. Rhizophyta, number 1, or amoeba. And we classify these on the mode of locomotion. So the mode of locomotion of them are pseudopods. Everybody knows what pseudopods are at this point. The next one, Zoomastigophora or flagellates. So their mode of classification obviously is a flagella. The next one are Sporozoa. Their mode of locomotion, they have none. So it's always a trick question. They like that question. There aren't any flagella, cilia, anything. And then Ciliata or ciliates, the mode of locomotion of cilia. So we're going to start out with the protozoa. The first one we're going to talk about is Entamoeba histolytica. And I filled that in for you guys on the papers. I try to put the ones on the papers. You do need to know the classes and the mode of locomotion, so it may seem redundant, but for each one I put them in, hoping that maybe since you have to write them in, you might remember it. So Entamoeba histolytica is a rhizophyta, again, or an amoeba. The locomotion is pseudopods. The disease is amoebic dysentery or amoebiasis. So it's a dysentery caused by an amoeba. Transmission, always no transmission, fecal-oral route. And for this type of microbiology, you need to know the infective forms. The infective form is a cyst, and the cyst forms go through the stomach acid, and that's why they encyst to form this real round, strong structure to get through the stomach acid. Once they get into the intestine, they excyst, and the other form is a trophozoite. Pathogenesis of this organism, it likes the colon, the cecum, the rectosigmoid area, and it causes what we call buttonhole ulcers in the mucosa. And they do, they look like little buttonholes. Now, in severe cases, the organism, the trophozoite, can burrow through, get into the blood, it likes the liver the best, but it can get into the lung, the brains, the heart, and in the liver it will form abscesses, and you have to drain them or take them out. Balantidium coli is a ciliata. Locomotion is cilia. Disease is balantidiasis. You just add the iasis on the end of balantidium. Fecal-oral route. The infective form again is the cyst. The other form again is the trophozoite. And the pathogenesis, this lines the lumen of the ileum or cecum. Causes diarrhea, stomach cramps. Giardia lamblia, a Zoomastigophora, or a flagellate. So we have flagella as the locomotion. Causes giardiasis, and I would bet the boards would like this one because we see this a lot. Fecal-oral route, again the infective form is the cyst, and then the trophozoite likes the duodenum and the jejunum. Pathogenesis, the trophozoite attaches to the bowel wall, so it prevents absorption, especially of vitamin A and fat. I'll stop for a minute to let you catch up. So where do we get this? Giardia can infect water sources, reservoirs, but also any of you campers or hikers. If you take a cup and take it to a stream that looks fairly clear and pick it up, you never know what's upstream, and animals cause this. So always when you're camping, take a filter with it. The symptoms of this are a greasy, I'm sorry for all of you people that are eating, a greasy, foul-smelling, bulky, full of fat stool. Sorry. Yeah, good. But because the trophozoites line the mucosa in the bowel, nothing can be absorbed, so fat goes right through and out in your stool. Trichomonas vaginalis, another Zoomastigophora, so the locomotion is flagellate, causes trichomoniasis. Transmission is sexually transmitted disease. The infective form is the trophozoite. There is no other form. So this is different from the other protozoa we're talking about. The infective form is the trophozoite. There's itching, burning, discharge, diagnosis. You can diagnose many ways. The most common form is a wet prep, where you actually look at the discharge and look for the trophozoites. Women are usually symptomatic, men are usually asymptomatic. So if anybody's diagnosed with it, your partners will also need to be treated. So, all right, Chemoflagellates. What are Chemoflagellates? Break it apart. They are flagellates found in the blood. The two that we're going to talk about, Trypanosoma and Leishmania. The first ones, and I put the brucei in the middle of your names in our notes. We just have Trypanosoma gambiense and Trypanosoma rhodesiense. You may see brucei in the middle of that, so don't be thrown off by that. They're the same thing. They are zoomastigophores. They have flagella. The disease is African sleeping sickness. Now, on these that have vectors, you definitely have to know the vector. So the vector is the tsetse fly. I think everybody in the world knows that for some reason. Pathogenesis is general wasting. You just kind of waste away. You can't sleep, you can't eat, and finally, in the worst case scenario, you'll lapse into a coma and eventually die. So Trypanosoma cruzi, a zoomastigophora. Again, the locomotion is flagella. The disease is Chagas disease. I would bet they ask about this one too. This just seems, we see it a lot in the South Americas. The vector, now the vector is kind of tricky. It's the triatomine bug, reduvid bug, kissing bug. There's a lot of different names for it, but it always has bug after it. So hopefully if they choose one, it'll be a something bug. I've seen, there's assassin bug, I've seen it called assassin bug, so I don't know what they'll use. And what happens is when the bug feeds, it defecates. It likes to hit like on a very thin area like the face, the eye, something like that. So when it starts to feed, usually it's at night, it defecates, you're asleep, it itches, and you scratch. The organism is in the feces, and when you scratch, the organism starts to tunnel in through the skin. So it's not injected by mouth, it's in the feces. So the pathogenesis, where the organism bites you, there's usually, or where the bug bites you, there's something called a shagoma, And it's just like a lesion, a little bite with a center in it, and it's usually around the eye or the mouth, wherever it's bitten you. Eventually, when the organism starts moving around, there's something called Romanes sign, and you have a swelling, a periorbital swelling on one of your eyes. There's a fever, lymphadenopathy. The organism gets into the blood, it gets into the tissue. The major problem that it causes is myocarditis. And this is the chronic form of it. Also, it can cause megaesophagus and megacolon. Diagnosis method, there are forms of serology testing. The one that we have in our notes, and I'm going to tell it to you, I'm not sure that they include it in your boards, but it is still in the textbooks. So we're going to talk about it as xenodiagnosis, and it's X-E-N-O, xenodiagnosis. You take a laboratory cultivated reduvid bug, put it on somebody who you think might have the disease, let it feed off of them, and then in a month examine the intestinal contents of the reduvid bug and see if there are any organisms in it. Is it fallible? Yeah, it's fallible. It doesn't always work, and it takes a long time. But Leishmania donovani. There are a couple Leishmanias you see on your sheet, Tropica mexicana and brasiliensis. They all, put a little thing on them, they all cause granulocytopenia, which we're going to talk about, but I want you to know they all do. All right, so they're all zoomastigophora, they're flagellates. The first one we're going to talk about, and that is caused by Leishmania donovani, is visceral leishmaniasis, or So just by visceral, you know it's going to hit the midsection in your gut here. Vector is the sand fly. Of course, all these organisms have to have different vectors. Reservoir, dogs, cats, rodents, livestock, so the reservoirs are around, but the vector itself is the sand fly. So the pathogenesis, the organism that infects us is the promastigote. Promastigote comes out of the sand fly into the human, and in the human it becomes an amastigote. The promastigote is flagellated, the amastigote is not flagellated. So of course, once it becomes an amastigote, it can't move. So what happens is the macrophages come around and phagocytize those amastigotes. That is how we diagnose this. We look for those macrophages with the amastigotes, and now the amastigotes are called Leishmania bodies, Donovani bodies, Leishmania Donovani bodies, LD bodies, any form of that. And they're almost always inside macrophages. You might be able to see some neutrophils. The best way to look for them is a splenic aspirate, but I don't know about you, I really don't want to have my spleen aspirated, but that's the best place to find them. You can find them circulating in the blood, but it's not as easy. So, these all hit the reticuloendothelial system. The liver, the spleen, and part of the reticuloendothelial system is the bone marrow. So the visceral especially causes an anemia and a granulocytopenia. Anybody remember what that is? A low white count. All right, so if we have a low white count, we don't have our white cells, that opens us up for secondary infections. So these people are very prone to have secondary infections because of the granulocytopenia. The granulocytopenia occurs because the organisms get in the bone marrow and it reduces the output of the bone marrow, red cells and white cells. So Leishmania tropica is a cutaneous form. That's all you really have to know. Leishmania mexicana is also a cutaneous form. Brasiliensis is a mucocutaneous form, and it likes the area of the mouth. It will actually, it becomes chronic, and it will eat away the soft palate, the nose. There's pictures of people out there with no noses, no soft palate. So, and those also will cause granulocytopenia and anemia, because again, it hits the bone marrow. Plasmodium species. This is a sporozoa. The locomotion is none. The species are Malariae, Ovale, Falciparum, and Vivax, or Vivax if you're from Michigan. It depends. Vivax, Vivax, however you pronounce it. The worst one is Falciparum. If I was a board writer, I would ask that. That is the worst one. And what happens, I think we all know this, it gets inside the red cells and cyclically it'll burst open the red cells. It reproduces inside of our red cells, it bursts them open, and the timing is dependent on the type of malaria. Now Falciparum is really bad because Falciparum will infect about 1/3 of your red cells, and when it bursts those open, it produces these little organisms that are going to infect other red cells. So each time they grow in there, you're losing 1/3 of your red cells. So you become severely anemic. Disease is malaria. The vector is the mosquito. The most serious is Falciparum. So the life cycle, we have life cycles in the human and life cycle in the mosquito. In the human, it's the intermediate host. All right, the intermediate host is always where there is not a sexual reproduction, it's just a growing. The definitive host is the mosquito. That's where sexual reproduction takes place. And again, if I was writing a set of the boards, I would ask that question. So, the sporozoite is the infective form. It comes from the mosquito, is injected into the human. The first stop is the liver. In the liver, it forms something called schizons. And these are large cells that have a lot of organisms in them. The schizons become merozoites. And what happens is all of those little organisms become, I want to say encapsulated, but that's not quite right. They become cells. They become cells. And once there's so many of them, the hepatocyte bursts open, it lets all of these merozoites free, and then it infects the red cells. So the first stop of this organism is the liver, then the red cells. The same thing happens in the red cells. They become schizons, then merozoites, the red cells burst open. Some of those become gametocytes. Whenever you see the term gametocytes, you always know that that is the precursor for sexual reproduction. Now, the gametocytes in the human will die, but if they're taken up by a mosquito bite, in the mosquito they will mate. So now we're going to talk about the mosquito life cycle. So they've taken up these gametocytes from biting somebody with gametocytes. They actually mate, they become oocysts, and then the oocysts form sporozoites. The sporozoites go into the proboscis of the mosquito, and then when somebody's bitten, it starts the life cycle over again. Pathogenesis, fever and chills. If they ask you a time, I'd say I would put every 72 hours, but again, the timing depends on the organism. With the falciparum, it's about every 72 hours. It's not real regulated. Every time you get a fever and chills, you're bursting red cells open, which is setting you up for an anemia. Toxoplasma gondii, it's a sporozoa, locomotion is none, causes toxoplasmosis. There's two forms that we see, acquired and congenital. Of course, congenital is passed from the mother to the baby. The infective form, again, are the cysts. So the life cycle, we're going to start with maybe mice or birds, and that is the infective host. The infective host, we term it. A cat eats those, and it becomes, in the cat, the cat then becomes the definitive host. All right, so the main way that humans get this is through cat litter. All right, so we've got the organism in the cat defecates in the cat litter and defecates cysts. When somebody goes to clean the cat litter, they get it on their hands, don't wash their hands properly, they ingest it, and they come down with toxoplasmosis. So this is one that the doctors say when you are pregnant, a pregnant woman should not handle the cat litter unless she's had a titer and she knows that she's been exposed to it before, but I would just stay away from cat litter. Naegleria fowleri. This is what we call a diphasic amoeba. It's kind of different from all the other ones we've talked about. There are two forms, an amoeboid form and a flagellate form. So the disease is primary amoebic dysentery, and what happens is the amoeba enters the brain through the cribriform plate and travels along the olfactory nerves. It enters the cribriform plate usually when somebody's swimming. Nice lake water. I know they've seen them in water parks, neti pots, hoses, lots of different places, but usually it's a warm water. We usually see it in the summer. Symptoms, to diagnose, you take symptoms and history of swimming. The symptoms are a lot like meningoencephalitis because it gets into the meninges. Metazoa, these are worms. Platyhelminthes are flatworms. They are divided into cestodes, which are tapeworms, and trematodes, which we call flukes, and they are flat leaf-like worms. And then nematohelminthes are roundworms, so nematodes are roundworms. So platyhelminthes or cestodes, we'll talk about them first, the tapeworms. Teniasolium, it's a platyhelminthe, it's a cestode. Two diseases, teniasis and cysticercosis. That's like cyst, C-Y-S-T, cysticercosis. Mode of transmission, there are two modes of transmission. Depending on the mode of transmission, depends on whether you get teniasis or cysticercosis. Teniasis, the end of teniasis is you have a tapeworm in your gut. Cysticercosis means you have cysts embedded in your muscles. And again, it depends on the mode of transmission. So if you eat larvae that is in the meat of like a pig, you will end up with a tapeworm or teniasis. If you ingest eggs from fecal contamination, like in lettuce or something like that, you will end up with cysticercosis, and that is the cyst that's embedded in the muscles. So the larvae from the meat go into the small intestine, they form a tapeworm, and then the tapeworm mates, where it forms eggs, and you excrete eggs in your stool. So this is humans, from humans to humans. If you ingest the eggs, again it's from fecal contamination, the cysticerci move into the brain, the liver, the muscle, and the heart, and they will stay in the muscle. They may have a question about what those little cysts are called in the muscle, and they're called nurse cells. I don't know if they'll include that or not, but they may. All right, Taenia saginata is beef tapeworm. It's a cestode. Again, you eat the larvae in the muscle of the meat, and you end up with a tapeworm. There is no cysticercosis in this disease. It just doesn't work like that. So this is usually less problematic than the pig tapeworm or the Taenia solium. Echinococcus granulosus. Again, it's a cestode. The disease is Hydatid disease. Mode of transmission, eggs from dog feces, canine feces. Don't forget wolves, I don't know, wolves, whatever, they're all canine feces. So don't look just for dogs. So the worm in the canine is the definitive host, drops eggs in the feces. The human ingests this. The humans are the intermediate host. The eggs hatch. They get into the circulation. They may get into the liver, the lung, the brain, and bone marrow, and form something called hydatid cysts. Do you remember this video I showed you of the liver? They're pulling the cysts out, and those are the hydatid cysts. Hymenoplepsis nana. It's a cestode. Hymenoplepiosis. Pathogenesis. This is eggs from humans to humans. The man is the intermediate and definitive host. And that is the question that I would ask. Which organism can be maintained only by humans? And it's Hymenoplepsis nana. Diphyllobothrium latum, a cestode, fish tapeworm. The life cycle, eggs are in the water from a mammal. It can be a bear, it can be human, it can be anything. And they form ciliated choroncidium, which are eaten by copepods in the water, which are eaten by fish, and they become something called pleurocercoid. That's the infective form, the pleurocercoid in the fish. And then the human ingests the fish. If it's not cooked, they ingest the pleurocercoid, and it forms a tapeworm in the intestine. This is the one, pathogenesis, and I would definitely write questions on this. If it becomes really severe, this is the B12 deficiency. It competes with the humans for B12. If you have a B12 deficiency, you guys are in Dr. Koch's class now. What kind of anemia does a B12 deficient? Megaloblastic anemia. What are the symptoms of megaloblastic anemia? Anybody remember? Neurosymptoms. Off balance, paresthesias, poor memory, the gait is really odd, anything like that neurologically. Pallor, also pallor because it's an anemia. Glossitis of the tongue gets that beefy red color. Memory loss, unsteady gait. All right, so if it's diagnosed, you want to get rid of the worm, and usually one shot of B12 will correct most of those neuro issues, and then you'll put them on oral B12 for a while. All right, trematodes, flat leaf-like worms. We sometimes just call these, in general, schistosomes. All right, so all you need to know about the Fasciolopsis buskii is that it hits the intestine, and it's a trematode. Clinorchus sinensis and Fasciola hepatica are the liver. Again, they're trematodes. And Paragonimus westermanni hits the lung. That's pretty much all that they ask about. Where do those hit? Now, schistosomes in general, they're trematodes. The disease is called snail fever or schistosomiasis. Yes, ma'am?
What was the, I can't even pronounce it, the one after those.
Paragonimus westermanni,
About
Clinorchus sinensis,
Yeah.
Liver. The organ is the liver. Paragonimus is the lung. It'll go to the lung.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. Then the schistosomes in general, again, they're trematodes, snail fever, or schistosomiasis. The intermediate host is the snail. I would ask that if I was writing questions. So what happens is eggs from human feces get into fresh water. These organisms have to have fresh water in order to hatch. They become something called mere. You guys need help? Are you all right? Where are you?
Snail fever.
Snail fever? Schistosomes, the class is trematode. The disease is snail fever or schistosomiasis. And snail fever, put a little arrow up there. The snail is the intermediate host. I would ask that question if I were writing boards. All right, so what happens is eggs from the humans are deposited in fresh water. This organism has to have fresh water in order for the eggs to hatch. They become something called miracidia. They are eaten by the snail. They have 2 life cycles in the snail. And then the snails deliver the larvae in the water. And the larvae are called cercaria. That one you want to write down, cercaria, because the C-E-R-C-A-R-I-A, something like that, cercaria. Those are the infective forms. And what they do is they penetrate the humans, usually between the toes. And then the eggs, will be carried to the site depending on the species. So we have a couple different species, and it will affect different sites. So this can be swimming in fresh water, rice paddies, people that work in rice paddies and their bare legs or whatever. So they penetrate through the toes. Schistosoma mancii, localization is veins of the mesentery. So the eggs are shed in the feces. Schistosoma japonicum, the same as above. Veins of the mesentery, and the eggs are shed in the feces. And then Schistosoma hematobium, localized in the pelvic veins, and the eggs are shed in the urine. So that's the difference between them. So I would ask a bunch of questions about this, but that's just me. All right, so nematohelminthes are roundworms. The first class are the nematodes. Again, we just say they're roundworms. They're round, like they look like pencils or round little things. Ascaris, that should be lumbricoides. There should be a B in there, lumbricoides. It's a nematode. Disease is ascariasis. Mode of transmission is eggs from humans. Pathogenesis, this can cause intestinal blocking. It can make you very nervous when the eggs die. It's almost a little toxic, and it can cause an anemia if you have enough of a worm burden. So the eggs get into the small intestine. They turn into larvae. They move through the small intestine into the liver. Then they get into the blood. From the blood, they can move to the lungs. From the lungs, you cough. It makes you cough at night. You swallow, and then it gets into the small intestine where they mate. And then you deposit eggs in the feces. So it doesn't, the first time it doesn't stay in the small intestine. It moves from there into the liver. And then it goes through the blood, the lungs, you cough, swallow, and then it gets back into the intestines where it mates, and then eggs are deposited in the feces. We see this in the United States, so we do see this. Trichinella spiralis, again a nematode, trichiniasis or trichinosis, there's a couple different ways you can say it. Larvae in meat of bear and swine, pigs, wild pigs, boar. Again, that would be a question I would ask. Hunters, people that hunt, tend to come down with this. Pathogenesis, big symptom is periorbital swelling. Come in to a clinic or whatever, periorbital swelling, you tell the doc you've been hunting, you ate some bear meat that you caught or some boar meat or whatever. Yeah, I thought I cooked it okay, but probably not. So what happens is you ingest the larvae that's in the meat muscle. The worm develops in the duodenum and they mate. Then they form larvae that get into the small intestine, into the blood, into the lymph, and then there's muscle encystation with these. So you'll actually have a cyst in your muscle from this. Isn't that fun? Okay, Enterobius vermicularis, star this one. Pinworm, aka pinworm. It's a nematode, the disease, pretty much everybody uses pinworm. There's threadworm, seatworm, but I think pinworm is the one they will use. The mode of transmission is swallowed eggs. The life cycle, you swallow the eggs, it forms adult worms in the ileum and cecum. The female migrates at night out to the anus where it lays eggs. Pathogenesis is anal pruritus, or itchy butt, itchy booty. The diagnosis is the Scotch tape test. In the morning, you pull the buttocks apart, put a piece of Scotch tape on the anus, put it on the slide, and send it to your lab professional to look at for the eggs. It's very quick. It's very easy. Wucheria bancroftii, lymphatic filariasis. Nematode, again, early stage is called filariasis, late stage elephantiasis. Mode of transmission is the mosquito. Pathogenesis are severe swollen lower extremities. What happens is the adult worms get in the lymph canals and they block the lymph canals. So usually below the belt is going to swell up. Y'all good? What do you need? Where did I lose you? Life cycle. The mosquito transmit the microfilaria. Man is the definitive host. The adults mate in the lymphatics, and they become the microfilaria, or they have microfilaria. The microfilaria get into the blood between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. So if we're going to find it by blood test, that's the time we need to take the blood. And what's interesting is that it's the night mosquito that transmits this. So the mosquito's going to bite at night, and it's going to have more of a chance of getting the microfilaria in the blood at that time.